Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the Haydn Symphony Crusade, and we're up to Symphony number 23 in G major, a perfect little symphony that illustrates how demented it ever could have been to consider Haydn's early symphonies immature, because this symphony shows him in possession of a musical language that is fully developed and sophisticated and absolutely amazing, remarkable in terms of what he wants to express. Now, this is a four-movement symphony with a minuet, and it has quite a few remarkable features, which I can't wait to tell you about. So let's just take it one movement at a time and see where we go. Now, the first movement could be an absolute clinic in the as a description, let's put it that way, of Haydn's handling of monothematic sonata form. Now, as I have pointed out before, monothematic does not mean one theme. It means lots of them, actually. What it means is that the music is front-loaded and that it begins to develop from the very, very first bar and just continuously does it all the way through the piece. So the normal divisions of exposition, development, and recapitulation, while they do apply, don't apply in the same way they do in works of the mature or high classical period. They are more fluid. And this is just the perfect illustration of that because this movement basically consists of two elements. The first element is a four-note phrase in long notes. In other words, the opening is yum bum bum ba. That's four notes, right? Ba-dum ba-da-dum. Then it goes ya-da-da-dum. It does that twice. It's a descending four-note scale. And then there's a little phrasey thing that goes up. And it goes da-da-da-dum, chunk-chunk, da-da-da-dum, chunk-chunk, da-da-da-dum, chunk-chunk. Four notes, and then a loud sort of two-note outburst. Those are the basic characters that we need to deal with for this first movement. And although my voice is completely wrecked, because I'm still getting over a cold, it doesn't matter. I'm going to play it for you, and you'll hear exactly what I mean. But when I talk about continuous development, I mean something very specific. That wonderful little character with the four rising notes and the chunk-chunks between them, do-do-do-do, chunk-chunk, do-do-do-do, chunk-chunk, that is going to appear in three different versions alone in the exposition, and it's going to generate the largest part of the development section. And I've actually prepared that for you as a separate example so you can hear exactly what I mean. I want you to just listen to it, and you'll hear three different versions of that particular character, and then the bit from the development section that leads back to the recapitulation. So you'll hear exactly how it works. Take a listen. See what I mean? It's just continuous development. And what's more, that little gesture, that squiggle, chunk, chunk, squiggle, chunk, chunk, in its basic outline, it's really just a quick little shuffle followed by a loud outburst. Then that repeats itself however many times Haydn wants to repeat itself. How many times Haydn wants to repeat it. I get so excited with these things. My tongue gets twisted. But that is one of the main characters in the first movement. And it's also going to be one of the main characters in the second movement. In fact, both of the ideas from the first movement, the descending four-note scale, ya da da da, that's the opening theme of the slow movement. And that little character, squiggle, squiggle, chunk, chunk, squiggle, squiggle, chunk, chunk, is also going to be the other main idea in the slow movement, except instead of having 4 rising notes, it has 5 quick notes. It doesn't matter what the little squiggly thing is between the chunks. That can be anything. It can be faster or slower or whatever. The idea is the opposition between a sort of fluid, wiggly thing and a rhythmic interruption. And that can be achieved either through note values. It can be achieved through dynamics, as you'll hear in the finale. Wait a minute. And you'll see exactly what I mean. But let me play you just how that particular idea develops as well in the slow movement. And then we can run, the complete first movement. You'll hear the whole thing and see how Haydn actually does it as opposed to how I extract it for your delectation. So here is the first movement followed by the same idea as it appears in the slow movement. You see what I mean? It's clearly the same idea. It's just been developed. It's this idea of continuous evolution and change that really represents Haydn's symphonic ideal. And I assure you that he was the only guy doing it at the time, at least to this degree of sophistication. And that's why I always say that, it's just stupid to think that these early Haydn symphonies are in any way immature. They are so characteristic of Haydn and so necessary to what the classical style would become in his hands, and then later in the hands of Mozart and Beethoven. So let's listen to the complete first movement. The other thing I want you to pay attention to, however, and the other reason I think that it is such an amazingly cogent example of sonata form, is that the principle of sonata form, the idea is that in the recapitulation, the material of the exposition is restated all in the same key. The idea is to achieve finality. It's to eliminate the disruptions that have happened earlier and the consequent modulation between different keys in which the musical materials take on different characters. Now, you've heard one of those different characters, and really it couldn't be more different, and it did a lot in the development section. And it's absolutely perfect as an example of what sonata form ought to be, that little disruptive element doesn't appear at all in the recapitulation. Not a bit. It's totally absent. And so by leaving that element out, and also by reducing repetition, where you'll hear some of these phrases get repeated twice or 3 times or 4 times. And in the recapitulation, Haydn only does them once or maybe twice. He really reduces the recapitulation substantially. In fact, the entire recapitulation takes about 45 seconds. The entire exposition, which this is supposedly a recapitulation of, takes about 1 minute and 15 seconds. So Haydn has actually reduced it by about 40% in the recap. So the idea that, for example, that the recapitulation is just a repeat of what the exposition was, only all in the same key, is total nonsense. The textbooks, which sort of say that's what it is, they're totally wrong, completely wrong. The idea is to give that feeling of stability. And sometimes it takes longer, sometimes it takes less long. But the point is that after the whole development section has gone by, there's no need and no reason to repeat the exposition literally. In fact, it's just as developmental in terms of what it does musically as anything we've heard before. The only difference is that the intent of that development is to establish a feeling of finality, of being home. And this particular movement, this wonderful, wonderful little movement, does it in such a clear and cogent way. It really ought to be a model for what the classical style would become, at least in my opinion. So let's listen to the entire first movement without repeats. It has a first half and a second half repeat, but we're going to play it straight through, and you'll hear exactly what I mean. And you'll really be surprised when it comes to the end. I think because the recapitulation is so foreshortened, it sounds almost unsatisfying by the time it stops. It kind of just stops. And there's a reason for that. I'm willing to give Haydn credit for doing that intentionally. Here we go. First movement. Wonderful music. That was the Northern Chamber Orchestra under Nicholas Ward on Naxos. Many thanks for the permission to use that material. Now, as I've already showed you, the slow movement is in fact built entirely out of elements from the exposition of the first movement. And that's one of the reasons I feel that Haydn was right to foreshorten that recapitulation so much, because this music is continuing to evolve. The end of the first movement is not the end. It's not really a fully independent movement. We have to hear the rest of the symphony to see just how this is all going to shake out. So I'm just going to play you the exposition now of the slow movement, and just keep in mind that descending four-note phrase, and then the wiggle wiggle chunk chunk wiggle wiggle chunk chunk idea, which is in this case based on little five-note descending phrases instead of four-note descending phrases. And I have something to say about that after you've heard it. So here is the opening of the slow movement, the exposition. Haydn has completely reimagined those elements from the exposition of the first movement, but they're recognizably the same elements. And that's the point I want to make. One of the things that Haydn discovered or was able to do or had a feeling for, I don't know how intentional it was, how subconscious it was. His music is music that is made to sound. It isn't paper music. It makes its effect purely when it's played, not on paper. And what Haydn understood was the acoustic value of reminiscence, of similarity, of doing things which don't have to be identical repetitions of something we've heard before, but which sound related. And so when we hear them, they give us this feeling of familiarity, of a family of themes, of related ideas. And that is one of the major binding elements in all of Haydn's symphonies. And it's something that absolutely can't be taught. And it's something that can't be seen on paper. You have to listen to it and hear it. And when you hear it, the familiarity becomes evident. You may not see it otherwise. You may not notice it. And that, I believe, is one of the reasons that Haydn's genius in these early works has for so long been unrecognized and unacknowledged, because people don't listen to it. And if you don't listen to it, you're not going to hear it. You're not going to know what he's doing. You can't see it on paper. You've got to listen to how the music sounds in order to understand how it all relates. And that is just, that's what geniuses do, right? Now, let's do the minuet and trio. Now, the minuet and trio has nothing to do with anything else in the symphony. It's in the same key, it's G major. So we've got that much going for it, but it is written on a completely different basis. And because the thematic working in this symphony is so dense and everything is so related to everything else, Haydn is absolutely right in wanting to give us something which is a complete contrast. And the fascinating thing about this minuet is that minuets are, they're dances, right? And they're generally supposed to be kind of light and fluffy and dancey and rhythmic. And Haydn's symphonic minuets may be dancey, but they may just as well not be. They could be something quite different. And this is quite different. This is a movement of great intellectual sophistication, because the entire minuet and trio is canonic. What does that mean? What it means is that it's based on one part following the other part, as in a round, like row your boat. That's a canon, right? And this minuet does that all the way through. The basic minuet, the minuet proper that comes back on either side of the middle trio section, that is a two-part canon. It's the upper strings versus the lower strings, with oboes and horns popping in with the melody here and there. And the trio is even more sophisticated. The trio is a three-part canon. It actually has to do with the number 3. It's a real trio. And everybody just comes one after the other playing the same tune. And it's really, really cool. So let's listen. I'm going to play this to you in reverse order, because it was actually easier to make the sound clip that way. You're going to hear the whole trio with its repeats, because it's short and it's really cool to hear it with its repeats. And then the whole minuet, which follows, which returns after the trio, in that order. So here it is, the canonic minuet and trio. Nifty, huh? And why does Haydn do it that way? Well, I think one of the reasons is because all of the other movements in this symphony are based on gestures which are quite small and quite short. But this minuet is based on long-lined melodies, and counterpoint on simultaneous layers of melody. It gives a very refreshing contrast, but also Haydn loved the possibilities of writing these contrapuntal minuets, and there are quite a few in his work. We already heard one of them. It was in Symphony No. 3, if I'm not mistaken, and there will be several more. The most famous occurs in his string quartet, Opus 76, No. 2, in D minor, where it's called the Witch's Minuet. God knows why. But Haydn wrote a lot of very sophisticated dance music that doesn't sound dancey at all. It's simply a wonderful little interlude in a style that gives us some contrast, some very refreshing contrast to the very close thematic working of the rest of the symphony. Because when we get to the finale, the finale. The finale is one of Haydn's first really funny pieces, deliberately funny, but it consists entirely conceptually of our main character, the squiggle, squiggle, chunk, chunk, squiggle, squiggle, chunk, chunk thing. That's what this finale is. However, in this case, the chunk chunks are 4 notes, cha-cha-cha-chum, like that, and the squiggle squiggles it's in 6/8 time, so it's da-da-da, ba-da-da, da-da-da, 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 cha-cha-cha-chum, like that. And that's what the entire finale is all about. It couldn't be simpler. It is, in a sense, the distilled essence of the first and second movements. It's sort of reduced to its most elemental form. It's a dynamic and thematic, would you call it a simplification, a reduction, a deconstruction of the main element, one of the main elements, 2 main elements really, that went into the first 2 movements, because those main elements were 4-note sniglets and that, soft, loud, or, chunk, chunk, wiggle, wiggle thing. And this finale combines those 2 ideas, because the chunk, chunk is now 4 notes and the wiggle, wiggles are a little bit longer, and you have the dynamic contrast, and that's it. That's what the whole symphony is about. But the fun thing is the ending. The ending is delicious, and I'm not going to give it away. I'm going to play you the entire finale without repeats, and then you will hear the ending for yourself. Go! You get the joke? This is, first of all, very remarkable. A symphony that ends quietly. But it ends quietly in a very unexpected way. You're not really sure the ending is the ending. And actually, if you play it with the second half repeat, it's even funnier, because it sort of peters out like that, and then it goes back to the beginning of the second half, which is cha-cha-cha-cha, like that, which is very startling. It will make you jump out of your seat, I guarantee it. And then the ending comes back again, and then you're really, really not sure that the ending is the ending. That soft little pizzicato, bloop, and it's over. It's absolutely delightful and charming and genuinely funny. I mean, it's impossible when you say to somebody, "Oh, isn't that funny?" If you don't get the joke, then it isn't funny. Obviously, you either get it or you don't get it. But it really is a wonderful bit of wit on Haydn's part, I think. I hope you get the joke too, and you get a chance to hear how Haydn can be funny and light and frothy and fluffy, but also just incredibly musically sophisticated at the same time. He's never sacrificing one quality for another. He always has his cake and eats it too. And that is what makes Haydn such a genius, and what makes this 23rd Symphony such a splendid example of just how sophisticated and endlessly inventive Haydn's thematic workmanship and his expressive variety, and all of the things that he was doing in these early symphonies. You won't find a better example than Symphony No. 23, which nobody plays and nobody cares about, nobody's ever heard of. It doesn't have a nickname. Nobody gives it two thoughts. But you really ought to, because you can dig into any single one of these early symphonies and find similar genius at work. Always. Always. That's the deal that you get with Haydn. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you for joining me on this Haydn Symphony Crusade number 23. Take care.